The twin moons of Gliese for 52b hung low in the sky, bathing the planet's crystalline forests in an ethereal glow. At the heart of this alien paradise, in a quiet, flickering hollow theater nestled between bioluminescent trees, Cass Harper flipped the last page of her journal and sighed. She had traveled across galaxies as a cultural anthropologist, documenting the myths and entertainment of alien species. Yet tonight, she felt utterly human, lonely, out of place, and drowning in the cold vastness of space. Her assignment had brought her to the planet Quorathi, a bustling hub of intergalactic trade and a melting pot of species. The Quorathi had an odd obsession with Earth cinema, specifically romantic films. It had become Cass's mission to curate a list of Earth's greatest alien romance movies for their archives, a task she found both amusing and deeply surreal. The hollow theater hummed to life as the Quorathi projectionist, a towering, cerulean-skinned being named Izora, prepared the evening's showcase. Eternal Starlight, a cult classic about a human astronaut falling in love with a sentient nebula. Cass leaned back, the plush seat adjusting to the contours of her body, and prepared to lose herself in the absurdity of it all. First time watching this one, a voice beside her inquired. Cass turned her head to find a stranger sitting a few seats away. He was unmistakably not human, but his features were humanoid enough to pass on the outskirts of Earth's fiction. Bronze skin shimmered faintly under the dim light, and his silver hair seemed to flow as if caught in a constant breeze. His eyes were the most striking, pools of deep violet with faint, star-like flecks. "It's research," Cass replied, her professional tone failing to mask her curiosity. The stranger chuckled, a rich, melodic sound. "Research? Do humans often research love stories about nebulae?" "Apparently, when aliens ask for it," she said, tilting her head toward Izora, who was delicately adjusting the projection crystals. He smiled, revealing sharp, yet oddly charming teeth. "Then you'll need more than just this film. There are better ones." Cass raised an eyebrow. "Are you an expert on human cinema now?" "Not exactly," he admitted, leaning closer. "But I've spent enough time on your planet to know what moves you humans." A spark of intrigue flickered in Cass's chest. "Who are you?" "Call me Kael," he said, extending a hand. Cass hesitated before shaking it, her fingers tingling at the warmth of his touch. "Well, Kael, if you're such an authority, what's the best alien romance film?" Kael leaned back, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "Depends on what you want, hope, heartbreak, or something in between. But if you're interested, maybe I can show you." Before Cass could respond, the theater dimmed, and the opening scene of Eternal Starlight unfolded in dazzling hues. But she couldn't focus. Her thoughts drifted to Kael and the sudden, inexplicable pull she felt toward him. As the protagonist on the screen declared their love for the shimmering nebula, Cass glanced at Kael. He was watching her instead of the film, his star-flecked eyes unreadable but filled with something magnetic. For the first time in her travels, Cass felt that perhaps the cold vastness of space wasn't as lonely as she'd thought. Chapter 2: A Galaxy Apart. Cass couldn't shake the feeling that Kael's sudden appearance in her life was more than coincidence. After the holo film ended, and the audience, a mix of Quorathi and other intergalactic species, began filtering out, she found herself lingering. She wasn't sure if she wanted to ask Kael more questions about human cinema or about himself. Kael stood, his movements fluid and precise, as if he were in tune with a rhythm only he could hear. "So," he began, tilting his head toward her, "what's the verdict on Eternal Starlight? Worthy of the Quorathi archives." Cass crossed her arms and smirked. "It's melodramatic, but I guess that's part of the charm. I'd give it a solid 7 out of 10. Kael laughed, a sound that seemed to resonate in her chest. "A fair rating. Though if you're looking for a real intergalactic romance, I'd say you've barely scratched the surface." "Oh." Cass raised an eyebrow. "And what would you recommend?" "Not here," Kael said, his tone dropping slightly. He glanced around the room as though he was searching for something or someone. "Let's just say the Quorathi obsession with your films doesn't cover the whole spectrum. I could show you stories that would make Eternal Starlight feel like a bedtime tale." Cass narrowed her eyes. You're being cryptic. I'm being careful. Kael corrected, his voice quiet now. Not every story is meant for every audience, Cass Harper. Her name on his lips felt strangely intimate, and it took her a moment to realize she hadn't told him what it was. How do you know my name? She asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Kael hesitated, his violet eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite place. I do my research too, he said finally, his tone light but evasive. Cass wasn't sure if she should feel flattered or unnerved. Before she could press him further, Izora approached, their towering frame casting a long shadow. Cass Harper, the projectionist rumbled, their voice like the distant echo of a thunderstorm. Your presence is requested at the archives. The council has reviewed your progress. Cass groaned internally. The Quorathi council had been breathing down her neck ever since she'd arrived, insisting that the project was of cultural significance. In reality, they were just impatient bureaucrats who wanted results yesterday. I'll be there, she said, forcing a polite smile. Izora nodded and left, their bioluminescent markings fading as they stepped into the corridor. Cass turned back to Kael, but he was already walking away. Wait, she called after him. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. I'm not done with you, she said, surprising herself with the boldness in her tone. Kael's lips curved into a slow smile. Good, he said, because I'm not done with you either. Before she could respond, he slipped into the shadows of the theater, leaving her with more questions than answers. The Quorathi archives were a sprawling labyrinth of crystalline halls, each chamber filled with holographic records, ancient artifacts, and peculiar items traded from countless worlds. Cass navigated the corridors with practiced ease, though her thoughts remained on Kael. When she reached the council chamber, the three Quorathi elders were already waiting. Their translucent skin shimmered under the light, and their elongated forms exuded an air of authority. Cass Harper, the eldest, began, their voice echoing unnaturally. Your progress report is overdue. Cass suppressed a sigh. I'm compiling a list. These things take time. Art and storytelling aren't exactly streamlined processes. The elders exchanged glances. The preservation of your species' cultural narratives is of utmost importance, the youngest one said. We must know what stories shaped your understanding of love. Cass hesitated, the weight of their words pressing on her. It wasn't just a movie list to the Quorathi. It was a way to connect with humanity, to understand something universal and elusive. I'll deliver, she said finally. The elders nodded, their glowing forms pulsing softly. As Cass turned to leave, the eldest spoke again. Be cautious, Cass Harper. The one you were with tonight, he is not what he seems. Cass froze, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? But the elders didn't answer. Instead, their forms dissolved into light, leaving her alone in the chamber. That night, back in her quarters, Cass couldn't sleep. Kael's face, his voice, and the council's cryptic warning replayed in her mind. Who was he? And why had she felt an instant connection, as if he were a missing piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was trying to solve? Unable to rest, she accessed her holopad and began researching recent arrivals to Quorath. If Kael wasn't from here, and she was certain he wasn't, there had to be a record of him somewhere. But as she sifted through the data, an alert flashed on her screen. Unauthorized access detected. Location: restricted archive level. Her heart raced. The restricted level was where the Quorathi stored their most sensitive data. And for some reason, she knew it was Kael. Without hesitation, Cass grabbed her jacket and bolted out the door, the cold glow of the twin moons lighting her path. Chapter 3: The Intruder. Cass's boots echoed sharply against the crystalline floors as she sprinted through the dimly lit corridors of the Quorathi archives. The air was heavy with an otherworldly hum, a sign that the building's energy grid was reacting to the security breach. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the stairwell that led to the restricted level. She paused, pressing herself against the wall to catch her breath. Her mind raced. If Kael was truly down there, what was he looking for? And why had the council warned her about him? She peered down the stairwell. The restricted level was shrouded in shadow, save for the faint bioluminescent markings that glowed softly along the walls. Cass hesitated for only a moment before descending the steps, her instincts propelling her forward. When she reached the bottom, she was greeted by a large, sealed door. Its surface shimmered with a complex pattern of shifting light, an advanced Quorathi lock. Cass's hollow pad vibrated in her pocket, and she glanced at it. The security feed showed someone standing inside the restricted chamber. Kael. He moved with purpose, his fingers dancing over a holographic console. The feed distorted briefly, and Cass realized he was overriding the archive's security system. Unbelievable, she muttered under her breath. Before she could think twice, she approached the door's access panel. She had learned a few Quorathi security tricks during her time on the planet, and while the lock was intricate, it wasn't impenetrable. She tapped into her holopad, rerouting the door's energy grid. The shimmering lights dimmed, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the restricted chamber was breathtaking. The walls were lined with crystalline shelves, each one containing glowing orbs of light that pulsed gently, as if alive. These weren't just archives. They were memories, stories, entire histories of civilizations long gone. And in the center of it all was Kael. He stood with his back to her, his silver hair catching the faint glow of the orbs. He was focused on a single orb floating above the console, his fingers manipulating the light as streams of alien text and images unfolded before him. Kael, Cass said, her voice cutting through the silence. He froze, his shoulders tensing. Slowly, he turned to face her, his violet eyes locking onto hers. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "Funny," she shot back, stepping closer. "I was going to say the same thing to you." Kael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think." "Really?" Cass crossed her arms, her tone sharp. "Because it looks a lot like you're hacking into a highly classified archive." Kael took a step toward her, his expression unreadable. "Cass, listen to me. This isn't about the Quorathi. It's bigger than that." "Then explain," she demanded. He hesitated, glancing at the glowing orb hovering behind him. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, gesturing to the light. "It's a memory archive," she said. "A record of someone's life, or a moment in history." "Not just any memory," Kael said, his voice low. "This is the story of the Celestian Accord, the first and only peace treaty between my people and yours." Cass blinked, caught off guard. "Your people? You're not human?" Kael smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Not entirely." Cass's mind reeled. "So, what are you? And why are you here?" Kael's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm half Celestian. My mother was human. My father wasn't." The Celestian Accord was their legacy, a fragile alliance that lasted only a few decades before it was erased from history. Both sides wanted to forget. It was too painful, too complicated. But why dig it up now? Cass asked, her voice quieter. "Because there are forces in the galaxy who don't want peace," Kael said. "And if they find out what's in this archive, they'll destroy any chance of it happening again." Cass stared at him, trying to process the weight of his words. "You think the Quorathi are one of those forces?" Kael shook his head. "No, but this archive isn't safe here. The wrong people are already looking for it. I'm trying to protect it." Cass took a step back, torn between skepticism and the inexplicable trust she felt toward him. "And what do you need me for?" Kael hesitated, then reached for her hand. His touch was warm, grounding her in the moment. "Because I can't do this alone," he said. "And whether you believe it or not, you're part of this story, Cass. You always have been." Her breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Before Kael could answer, the room's energy shifted. The crystalline walls pulsed violently, and a sharp alarm blared through the chamber. "They found us," Kael muttered, his voice tense. "Who?" Cass asked, her heart racing. Kael's eyes darkened. "The ones who would rather see the galaxy burn than let us rewrite its story." He grabbed the orb from the console, tucking it safely into a pouch on his belt. "We have to go. Now." Cass hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and questions. But as the walls began to crackle with energy and the sound of approaching footsteps filled the air, she realized she didn't have a choice. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "But you owe me answers." Kael nodded, his expression serious. You'll get them. I promise. And with that, they ran. Chapter 4. Starlight Redemption. The corridors of the Quorathi archives erupted into chaos. Alarms wailed, lights flickered, and the hum of approaching enforcement drones grew louder. Cass and Kael sprinted through the crystalline maze, her heart pounding as she struggled to keep up with his long strides. Where are we even going? She shouted. There's a back exit near the east wing, Kael called over his shoulder. If we're lucky, we can slip out before they surround us. Cass wasn't feeling lucky. Behind them, the drones appeared, their sleek metallic frames reflecting the flickering lights. They emitted a piercing sound before firing stun beams that seared past her, narrowly missing. Less talking, more running. Cass snapped. Kael glanced back, smirking despite the danger. I like your spirit. Save the compliments for after we're not being chased by killer drones. Kael reached into his belt pouch and tossed a small sphere behind them. It exploded in a flash of light, temporarily disabling the drones. That'll slow them down, he said. They rounded a corner, and Cass nearly collided with him as he came to an abrupt halt. Ahead of them, a squad of Quorathi enforcers blocked the exit, their crystalline weapons glowing ominously. Kael, Cass hissed. Tell me you have another one of those fancy gadgets. Kael's jaw tightened. I have something better. He stepped forward, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. Let me talk to them. Are you insane? Cass whispered. Trust me, Kael said, giving her a look that was impossible to ignore. Before she could argue, Kael addressed the enforcers in flawless Quorathi. His voice was calm but commanding, and Cass couldn't understand a word of it. The enforcers hesitated, their glowing weapons dimming slightly as they exchanged uncertain glances. Then, one of them, a tall Quorathi with an intricate crest marking their status, stepped forward. You have violated the sanctity of our archives, they said in heavily accented universal. Explain yourself, Celestian. Kael didn't flinch. I wasn't stealing. I was protecting something that doesn't belong in a vault. Something that could unite our people instead of keeping us apart. The enforcer's gaze shifted to Cass. And the human? Is she your accomplice? I'm just the one who keeps him alive, Cass said, crossing her arms. Kael smirked. She's more than that. The enforcers murmured among themselves, their crystalline forms glowing faintly as they deliberated. The leader finally lowered their weapon. We will let you leave, but the council will hear of this. Kael nodded. That's fair. Cass's jaw dropped. That's it? We're just free to go. Sometimes diplomacy works, Kael said, taking her hand and pulling her toward the exit. Outside, the cool night air hit Cass like a wave. The twin moons cast their light over the crystalline city, but Kael didn't stop to admire the view. He led her to a sleek starship hidden in a grove of bioluminescent trees. Once inside, Kael initiated the launch sequence. The ship hummed to life, and they ascended into the stars. Cass slumped into the co-pilot seat, finally letting herself breathe. Okay, she said, turning to Kael. Now you owe me those answers. Kael's fingers danced over the controls, but he nodded. You deserve the truth. The orb we took, it's not just a record of the Celestian Accord. It's a key. A key to what? To the Celestian Vault, Kael said, his voice heavy. It's an ancient repository created by my people, containing the technology and knowledge that could end wars across the galaxy. But it's also a weapon in the wrong hands. The Accord was meant to ensure it would never be used for destruction. Cass stared at him. So, you're telling me we just stole the key to a galaxy-changing treasure chest? Pretty much. Kael gave her a sheepish grin. And now, everyone's going to come after us for it. Kael's expression turned serious. Yes, but that's why I need you, Cass. Me? Why? Because you're human, he said simply. Your people were part of the Accord. The vault will only open with the presence of a human who understands love, not just as a concept, but as something real. And you, Cass, you've seen the stories, live them. You're the one. Cass blinked, overwhelmed. That's insane. Maybe, Kael said, his violet eyes locking onto hers. But it's the truth. And I can't do this without you. She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she realized why she'd felt drawn to him from the moment they met. It wasn't just chemistry, it was destiny. Fine, she said, exhaling. But if we're doing this, you'd better not get me killed. Kael grinned, relief washing over his face. Deal. As the ship sped through the starlit void, Cass gazed out the viewport, the enormity of their mission settling over her. The galaxy was vast and full of danger, but for the first time, she didn't feel small. Kael reached over, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Whatever happens, he said softly, we're in this together. Cass nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. Together. And as they disappeared into the stars, the faint glow of the orb pulsing between them, Cass realized that the greatest stories weren't just written. They were lived. The end.